As ever. Go for it.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Samantha Capon.
well, thank you so much for being with us, Prof. It's lovely to be with you. And behind you, and I think that your background is, in inverted commas, real, unlike mine,
Hmm.
because I'm in the middle of central Mexico in the middle of the night, and the background that I'm showing is the Mediterranean. I can see what looks like rainforest over your
It's
right
uh
shoulder,
it's eucalypt forest.
eucalypt forest, and over your left shoulder, something wonderful, some fabric design hanging from the wall.
Oh yes. Oh, that's interesting that you can see that. I don't know what people can see from my calendar, well, from their cameras. But to start with the forest, our university campus is situated in Tui Forest, which is one of Australia's largest urban forests. We have a population of about 70 koalas. So frequently I have meetings with people and look out the window and there are koalas just in these trees here. But I can also see the city skyline just over the horizon as
Uh-huh.
well. So
Uh-huh.
very lucky. And the artwork, which is nice that you can see, is a gift from a Vietnamese PhD student. So
Uh-huh.
I've got lots of trinkets from students around my office and colleagues, which is nice.
I was once walking to the car park at Griffith University when I was confronted by a goanna.
Yeah, we don't see them that often anymore, unfortunately.
Well, I was just visiting there. I was trying to get to the car park, and there was a set of concrete steps, large circular objects that enabled you not to go into the swamp or whatever. And I
Stepping
got
stones,
halfway
yeah.
across, and the goanna got halfway across, coming in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's sadly I haven't seen one around. I've been here for quite some time, and I remember new international students, especially getting quite a shock when they're sitting at cafes to have this big dragon-like creature appear because they used to mill around the bins, of course, you know.
A place where I used to work in Colombia had a bank on campus. And I once went to the bank to make a withdrawal and was astonished to see one, or whatever the Colombian version thereof is, in line with about a dozen students waiting to do some banking. They get around.
Most appropriate, yeah. If you're going to anthropomorphize them.
So, Prof, can you share with us what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you? What's happening?
So it's a good question, and I'm sure the answer would change on whatever particular day you ask that.
Of
Just
course.
at present, I have come from a whole day workshop yesterday, which was quite energizing with
Mhm.
a few disciplines, but very economist heavy, people interested in addressing questions regarding agriculture, environment, and resources for Queensland, so for the state of Queensland in Australia, and how we start addressing some of those challenges. So, as an ecologist with vague interest in a lot of different disciplines, attending that, being in a room of economists who are very convincing a lot of the time and are also convinced in the superiority, I think, sometimes of their their discipline for addressing these questions. I am very occupied today with thinking about how we can be more transdisciplinary, how we can, you know, we all recognize that these challenges that we're facing, global challenges, societal challenges, are so multifaceted, and they can't be defined or addressed through a single lens. And yet we're still finding it so challenging to even talk to each other across disciplinary boundaries,
Mhm.
just even in terminology or language or the assumptions that we make about people's, even their character in relation to the disciplinary backgrounds they have and their value sets. And I know as an ecologist in a room of economists that I'm being judged all the time for what they think I'm bringing or what my value sets are as I'm doing to them. And so I feel I'm kind of occupied today with thinking about how can we get better? How can we get better at bring all of our valuable perspectives and approaches together to, you know, address these quite urgent problems and understand them.
I'm
Yeah.
hoping that there was some feminist economists and ecological slash environmental economists there, because sometimes they're not so caught up in the ratiocinative, selfish bastard that is at the heartbeat of bourgeois economics. Sometimes they're actually interested in finding out what people think and feel and believe and how they function rather than a fantasy thereof. Were any of them in the room?
I don't think that kind of theoretical sort of stance came through. There were plenty of women in the room, which was great.
No.
Um, but definitely increasing recognition, as well as the recognition that we need to be more transdisciplinary. A lot of emphasis on the need to engage the community in defining
Oh, really?
and
Okay.
approaching
Mhm.
problems. And yet I sense that there's also disciplinary difference in terms of how we engage with the community as well. So whether or not it's, bringing the community along is telling them what you're doing and then
Were
going
you,
back and
do you think you were under suspicion of being a tree hugger?
always.
Always.
Yes, always. Yes, definitely. Oh, from other disciplines, and then in my own discipline, not tree huggy enough. I like a treeless landscape.
Oh, interesting. So ecologist signifies to these other domains, sort of wine, cheese, and trees. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lovely way to put it. I think so, and possibly, very anti any development or,
Ah,
hands off. Let's
right,
lock up the environment and
right.
exclude
And keep it
people,
safe.
except for First Nations people.
I, by the way,
Yeah.
am celebrating today. I don't know whether this news has hit you yet, that New York State has just decreed a moratorium for a year on any new data centers being built.
Wow, isn't that great news?
It is incredible for environmental reasons. And you won't be astonished to learn that the immediate move by by capital is to go to indigenous leaders and say, you've got a certain sovereignty over where you are. Could you maybe support us and give us the
Uh,
right to blah, blah, blah? I mean, they're insatiable. They're insatiable.
yeah.
But there is indigenous resistance too. So anyway, not to put you on the spot about that, but for me, it's an incredible development right across the United States on a bipartisan basis. Right and left come together to say, sorry, we don't want the destruction of our natural environment. We don't want electricity prices going up. And most of all, we don't want our water being exhausted for the purpose of
Yes.
data
Yeah.
centers. Now, moving on to that, if I could, because it looks like it's a fairly dry day out there, but water is one of the things that I think brings your work together. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think water is something that brings us all together as well, all divides, as the case may be, and different areas of the environment. And now, yes, as you say, different sectors and different industries as well. So something that's flowing through and connecting us. And clearly, water demands from technology and AI is of great concern. I mean,
Oh,
never really sure about the data, but the figures are frightening, I suppose. I have teenage daughters who are constantly on my back about not using any AI,
are
um,
they? That's
and
great. You
telling
know that
me,
I recently discovered, you probably know this, that one can actually disable Google Chrome's feature, which tries to direct you straight to artificial intelligence answers to queries.
I didn't know that,
You
but
can. It's a bit of work because all these people
yeah,
have basically invested so much in artificial intelligence that they're forcing the rest of us to use it. But you can't
yeah, yeah.
stop it. You just have to, anyway, ask your daughters and they'll,
Yeah, she'll know. Well, she keeps trying to make me use there are some greener
uh-huh,
varieties, I think like greener browsers that plant trees or something.
very good. Now, you live in a country that is one of the most arid uh, in the world. Actually, I've been doing work recently in Chile on artificial intelligence data centers, and it really is the driest place around. And of course, it's incredibly dry places. The deserts are exactly where these places are building data centers
Yeah.
because there's no erosion of their hardware. as a consequence of water.
Yeah, right.
Been
And often
unbelievable. So you're in a very, very, very arid country, but you're in a bit of it that is unusual because it has internal river systems, right? And a variety of climates. So what's the jag with water in Queensland?
yeah, well, I mean, I guess my research area is a bit unusual in that I work on wetlands in dry lands. So I've been very fortunate in my career to study some amazing desert wetlands, which, as you say, can be hyper arid in some parts, so amongst the driest parts of our whole planet. And yet, when they're wet, they're very, very wet. And I've got to see all of those different faces of these landscapes, and I kind of am very attracted to that variability and unpredictability, almost addicted, I guess. I particularly love going to see a very dry landscape first. That's my preferred way of meeting a place, and then getting to see how it transforms so rapidly and incredibly once there's
You know,
water
I
there.
lived for many years in LA, and the two spectacular things that happen, as you know, in Southern California, apart from earthquakes and people developments, are one, fire, because suddenly you get vegetation that hasn't been seen for half a century, and two, unbelievable thunderstorms. You know, in
Love a
January,
good thunderstorm.
I mean, like I've never seen. I mean, where the rain really is just completely engulfing you, right? And for the other 350 days of the year, it's just sunshine. So tell us about, I must confess, I didn't know the expression desert wetland until I read your work. So if there's anybody else out there who isn't familiar with this, can you explain it to us?
Yeah, so the kind of systems that I work on, they have their average annual rainfall is very low. So to be arid, you're under 500 mils, that's semi-arid, then under 250 mils a year, you're arid, and then under 50 mils a year, hyper-arid, which are the most desert kind of environments around the world. But when rain does fall, it can often fall very intensely, a lot of rain in a very quick time, and lead to these really big floods. And the catchments that I work in Central Australia or Western Queensland, they're fed by these big storms and cyclones that happen in the north, so Central Queensland, and coming in from affected by the monsoon. And so you have this a lot of rain. And so even though it's not raining in the wetlands and the deserts where I'm working, a whole lot of water comes downstream, sometimes quite slowly. So you have a lot of time to prepare, get your vehicles out for field work. And that water can come down over months, and then it can sit around because the sediments where I work are often clays. So they hold the water for a very long time. And the rivers can transform from being, well, just sort of ditches, dirt ditches with nothing, to huge areas, expanses of water that are bigger than the English Channel, just massive, and that can stay for quite a while. In fact, in Central Australia, we've had a very wet period until recently, and the Lake Eyre Basin, that whole central part of Australia, has been very wet, very flooded, and that attracts a lot of birds. Amazing. The largest pelican colony in the world, for instance, has been observed at Lake Eyre. So, tens of thousands of birds. I've been lucky enough to see some of those. They're quite incredible. And then as the water recedes, for me, that's when it gets really exciting. So the drawdown of the water, because that's when the plants, this huge diversity of plants that sort of sit as dormant seeds in the soil, just waiting for these conditions to occur, germinate, and then the insects come in, more birds, and you get these lush, diverse meadows of flowers, and it's just something very spectacular and ephemeral, so it might not last for very long, and then it's back to the dirt. But if you've seen it and you know that it's all just waiting there, ready to return with more water in the future. So I
So,
guess the concern with climate change is that intensity of wetting is likely to change. There's longer dry periods, and then much flashier flooding.
Mm. So what do you do, Prof? Are you standing in the lecture hall telling students about things when the buzzer goes and it says, on your bike, Prof S, we've got a phenomenon here. We need you to come and look at it, and off you trundle. And then you look at it and you take photographs and measurements. I mean, what actually happens?
Well, first of all, I wish that was the case, but unfortunately, most teaching is online like this these days, except for with graduate students. But in terms of monitoring and engaging with these environments, we receive funding for research from a variety of sources. Um, One of our biggest projects, and there's a big community of people working on this in Australia at the moment, is to monitor and assess the ecological outcomes of water that's been bought and is now held by the government for environmental purposes. So in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is our biggest and most productive water basin in Australia, in the last decades of last century, there were lots of environmental problems emerging, huge blue-green algae blooms stretching kilometers, toxic algae, the riparian and floodplain trees, a lot of tree death and mortality occurring, really steep declines in the numbers of water birds being observed, and then also just over-exploitation of the water resources themselves. So, how to share that resource amongst all the different human
Mm.
users.
Mm.
So we've had this very big and complex and ongoing program of water reform, which I feel like I've been relatively lucky, I guess, that my career is aligned with, because it's meant ecology has been important. The environment's been a big part of this equation, and it's also given me exposure to the social, cultural, economic, political dimensions of these decisions. So now we have a significant pool of water that's held by our government to deliver to wetlands and rivers solely to repair and restore damage that's been done to the environment, and I guess to enhance its capacity to adapt to climate change. So as part of that portfolio of environmental water holdings, some funding is given to monitoring the outcomes of those environmental water deliveries, so that we can tell society, what that water is achieving for the environment. Has it done what we've expected to do, or what are we learning? And can we use that water more effectively going into the future? So that's a lot of our work, is going out and monitoring and assessing these environmental water deliveries.
So literally observing the water table, plant life, animal migration, etc.
Yeah.
Seeing what's
Yeah.
happening, writing down categories and numbers of what you see and smell and feel, and comparing that with other periods. Yeah, is that right?
Well, I guess that the smelling and feeling, I mean, those are the parts that as ecologists, we're very lucky to experience by having these incredible immersive experiences in places that a lot of people just don't get to go.
Yes.
And when you're surrounded by just vegetation that's been recently flooded and you can hear the birds and the insects, it's incredible. But yeah, I guess hard to communicate that in our scientific reports
No, I
and
understand,
papers.
but it maybe is part of what animates you. The other day, I was excited and perturbed to see a monarch butterfly. They're not supposed to be here in central Mexico in July. Wonderful creatures though they be, it's not meant to happen.
I only know about them from Barbara Kingsolver, but
But it's one of these indices of climate change that's frightening. And I speak to long-term residents of Guadalajara, where I live, including young people, including people not super educated. They're really terrified about what is so visible to them in terms of climate change. What's
yeah.
that like in Australia? Is there, I mean, here in Mexico, it's pretty much accepted that this is happening. But as you know, in the United States and in some other countries, there is a rejection of the notion that it's happening, or a rejection that it's human formed, or a rejection that it's in some way deleterious. What's the public opinion like, would you say, in Australia in terms of what happens when you guys present your findings? What happens when the federal government intervenes on water?
I think we've definitely reached that level of acceptance amongst the general population that it's happening. Attribution is another matter. I'm not really sure where we stand on that generally. Obviously, most people that I spend time with would appreciate that human attribution. And
Mm.
as to whether or not it's deleterious, I think that's definitely quite contested
Mhm.
still. So I think because of the nature, the unpredictability and the variability of the systems that I've been brought up in and work in, very unpredictable, very variable, very overridden by this unpredictability in the availability of water, and yet life abounds. I think I lean on the side of optimism. So and I can appreciate and sympathize for people who are more used to more predictable, seasonally driven systems who are seeing these changes and the kind of
Mm.
grief and solastalgia that that must be inducing. But I also feel as though there is lots of hope as well. You know, nature is amazing, people are amazing, and I think it's easy to look at changes and write systems off and species off as though they're just not going to survive and they can't. But I think nature keeps surprising us.
Mm.
Um, you know, in the millennium drought here, we had what 10, 15 years of some places that had no water, and you'd hear people, very experienced ecologists, and then being listened to by policymakers, sort of saying, "Oh, well, that wetland, it's dead. You know, there's no point in giving that any more water, or you may as well crop it or whatever." But then when the drought broke, uh, you know, those seed banks I was talking about before, and then things coming in from
Mm.
elsewhere, they've sprung back to life. And in fact, one of the wetlands, a Ramsar site that we've been working on, Narran Lakes, and I've been working on it for over 20 years. In these recent 2 years, so despite the droughts, despite being having wildfires for the first time in Western recorded history in these areas, has recorded significantly more species of plants than ever before that we've
Mhm.
recorded. So um, I feel I know things are changing, and I know that some of those changes are utterly depressing, but I think it's important that we also have hope for you know, what nature can move on to, and those changes. And we shouldn't hang on to the way things have been within our memories.
Uh, I loved a story in the New York Times today. I mean, loved a video of a man in what was described as, a barbecue area being speared by a bison. It just ran
Oh,
up
I
to
saw
him.
that. Yeah,
I mean, he survived, he's okay, but this was
yeah,
presented as, this is a camping ground. And I'm looking at it thinking, well, that's your way of describing it. For this bison, it's one more area where it needs to eat, sleep, and cavort that's been taken away from it. It's not a camping ground, it's a bison ground. Or it's not a bison ground, it's a camping ground, right? These are the things that happen. When I lived in London, I would see, I lived in central London. Tragically, in the middle of the night, I'd go for a walk and there'd be foxes everywhere,
yeah.
just desperately looking for food. And so it's often animals that I worry about in these stories because so much of their livelihood has been almost irrevocably fractured as a consequence of human population, and so on. I get very worried about them. The plants I get less worried about because of, as I said, this amateurish experience of these amazing fires in California, which do terrible
Yeah, yeah.
things, but also help these forms of life rebound that have not been seen for
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah, and I think exactly I worry about the animals too, and I think that ethics of care, and I think there is still this, you know, having thought about this in light of Peter Singer's significant birthday recently as well, that that distinction between animal liberation and concern for animal welfare and
Yeah.
environmental concerns, and that conflict. And I think, you know, things like feral animal control, they really bring this to the fore. And of course, in Australia, you know, we've just embarked on recent programs of aerial culling in our alpine national parks, and you know that really brings that to a head. Is what are our objectives and who are we when we're engaging with the environment and other species. Is, how do we see ourselves in these interventions? And I don't think we discuss it enough. What values we're really trying to
Mm.
pursue or virtues we're trying to encourage here. So very difficult, and I think leads to lots of grief and people not talking to each other. But I think we do need to tackle it more. And ecology and environmental objectives, I think, are often guilty of not considering the animals, not considering animal welfare
Oh, is that
sufficiently.
so? Interesting. Now, that brings us back to where we began, Prof, when you were describing your experience with the economists. And I wanted to talk a bit about these interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary conversations that sometimes take place, sometimes don't need to take place. What are some of the positive versus negative experiences you've had in terms of bringing together people who epistemologically, methodologically, theoretically have just different lenses on the world?
Yeah, well, I think the starkest kinds of ones are people that come from private sector, agricultural industries from farming backgrounds, and then bringing environmental interests and these assumptions that they're going to be at odds with each other. And when you actually discover that you're not so much at odds and that you do have similar values and care about things, and you're making similar observations, but just using different language to describe how you're seeing and feeling about the environment. I think that's amazing. And recognizing then that we are kind of seeking similar outcomes, but it's that need to discuss those things a little bit more and be upfront about the language that we're using. I think in my experience working on a lot of properties out west, farms. Farmers are constantly engaging with their environments and can read the landscape and know so much.
Yes.
And what they don't like is someone who's not living there coming in and saying, well, that's what's happened there, when they've seen something completely different. And it's a closed conversation. So I think that willingness to have an open conversation, whether or not it's between farmers and environmentalists or between economists and ecologists,
Mm.
that acknowledgement that you are just looking through your lens and that there are other ways of looking at things is the important ingredient to having those good conversations.
And in your domain, starting with your daughter, I guess, activism is a very big deal. There are so many non-government organizations, famous and barely known, relatively pacific and oriented towards reformist public policy versus direct action,
Mm.
people who
Well,
engage in disruption. What's the relationship between ecology as a scholarly endeavor and activism?
yeah, I think that's such an excellent question. I was just only talking to a new research assistant employed today about a fabulous professor who you should talk to, who you probably know maybe at the University of New South Wales, Professor Richard Kingsford, otherwise known as Dr. Duck, who came from national parks and now has run this very long-running aerial waterbird survey over the whole of Eastern Australia. So every year they fly small planes and count all the waterbirds, which is an amazing data set. But he's very passionate and political. And I remember seeing him when I was about my eldest daughter's age and speaking passionately about water for our inland wetlands. And he's a big reason why I do what I do, and am lucky enough to work with him now. So I think, there are some people that really have managed to straddle those different areas very well, although I believe he has received death threats and it's a difficult line for him to have walked. And then on the other hand, I've had plenty of mentors who have advised that, the role of a scientist or an ecologist is just to provide that very straightforward, as objective as possible kind of advice without any kind of advocacy.
Mhm.
And I think that's the ideal for science, is to provide that, some kind of reproducible, shareable, as unbiased as possible, but it is impossible. So we also recognize that it's absolutely impossible because we're all humans. And in this age of emerging AI, that's fantastic, I think. And so for me, I feel like you want to be able to communicate, but you want to communicate your biases as well. So I think that we provide advice, but it's always in the context of the advocacy. So I'm not going to work on these systems and not say, I don't love wetlands. I love these wetlands I work on,
Mm-hmm.
and I love animals. And that's the position I'm coming from. I think, and if you're upfront with the stakeholders and policymakers, that's where you're coming from, that helps them interpret your biases. But I think we're all political. And to me, the worst is to pretend you're not. And to hide behind science as though, there's some, God-given way the environment is supposed to be, and that shuts people out from any kind of decision making. I think that's really dangerous at the moment, and a lot of environmental policy is falling into that trap of saying, and this is, for me, I guess this is where some of the environmental economics is challenging, when there are concepts of optimization. So, developing these models to work out what's the optimum way that society should be. And it's a bit, to me, it's a bit, like Hunger Gamesy or something, it's very dystopian. Everyone in that kind of model, then you're working out what's the
They think
optimum way you should live your life. Like,
those people think that everyone is as selfish as they are. And guess what? We're not.
yes,
On that score, I'm dragging you into controversy here, but controversy that you were
drag
part.
away.
Okay, here comes the drag, Prof. Um, and this is the only sort of gotcha moment, as it were, I promise. But you're one of the authors, with about 4,500 others, of a piece called The Politicization of Science in the Murray-Darling Basin, Australia. And this is in part a response to a criticism of
Mm,
some of you. I'm not sure whether you were one of the people criticized
I
for
am, yes.
captured. So, were you captured? And can you give us the scoop? Like, what the heck was all this about? And is it a live issue? And what do you think about it now?
I feel very hurt by that, the initial paper, that paper was a response
Okay.
to. So the authors of that first paper were colleagues that I would have had open, robust discussions with. So for them to publish something and point the finger and name particular people, I think was unethical and just not very nice.
Okay.
Um, People who themselves have also worked with these government organisations. And as I said before, my career's aligned with water reform. I like to see it more as though we're a community working on a very hard, complex topic, and there's a
Mm,
lot of us, and a
mm.
lot of us who've worked together for a long time. I haven't seen that as capture. I mean, people are working, jumping between state and Commonwealth government departments and NGOs and academia all the time and mixing. And I have written very openly and very you know, vocal about my criticisms of the political choices. But I think that's part of the process. So yeah, I think that initial paper that the later paper responded to was a bit sensationalist and attention grabbing, when it's impossible at the level of expertise and career longevity that the people that were named have, not to have conflicts of interest, and it's a good thing. Again, it's about being human and being engaged. We're hooked into the community. We're not external robots spitting out advice. We passionately care about what we're doing, and we're trying to improve it. And sometimes that means we agree with the decision maker, and sometimes it means we disagree. But I think it's our responsibility to work with those policymakers and decision makers in a friendly manner, just as it is to communicate through forums like this with the broader public about
Mm.
about what we support. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it was an interesting period, and there are certainly people that don't talk to each other after that. So
Right. I mean, an evil war criminal, Henry Kissinger, who occasionally said some smart things and had insights, saying that, ha ha ha, academic fallings out are very severe because the stakes are so low. Well, sometimes the stakes are actually quite high, not only in terms of people's careers, but in terms of the complex issues that they're grappling with,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
Everything from the
agreed.
question of the basin through to what it means to be complicit or not with government agendas and whether receiving government money makes you complicit, right? For example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do some work that's funded by coal mining at the moment, and that's something I probably wouldn't have thought I would do. But then I think about it in the context of uh, how that's operating. So government requires coal mining to look at the environmental impacts. That's where the funding is going to understand these impacts, and then we've been engaged to assist with that. But we're certainly not going to greenwash any of those impacts. And I think that's where scientific literacy is important, so that everyone can engage with science enough to be questioning suspicious, and where we should encourage debate. So you don't just accept things that are published as truth, or even that there is any truth, I guess. That, I think for me, one of the dangerous things that's discussed at the moment is this idea that scientists should all be in agreement before it's taken to policymakers or politicians or the public, because disagreement looks messy, and then you won't get much traction. I think we're much better at acknowledging that uncertainty is inevitable, and also a great thing. That because uncertainty equates to hope in many ways. So, I think that we should be trying to get back to a situation where there is, or an improved situation of public dialogue around these things that we care about, and that involves scientists and the community and politicians, and not be afraid to question things. And to me, that's what science is. Science is questioning things and addressing those questions in a way that's collaborative. That's the point. It's not
Mhm.
personal. It's about
Mhm.
doing it in a way that you can share with other people.
And one of your pieces that I think does that wonderfully is on a slightly kindler, gentler topic for us than, you know, people attacking you and you guys biting back. And that's the singing streams piece.
That was a PhD student that I was lucky to be involved with, but I think I've been exposed to that ecoacoustics since doing a short postdoc in Sweden, where people were the early days of that kind of freshwater acoustics, putting microphones into streams and listening to the hydraulics and the movement of sediment over the bottom of the stream beds,
Yes.
um, in the boreal forest. And that's caught on quite a bit here now. So like birdsong, people can record fish and insects and I guess platypi in Australia, and water rats and things like that. And then they can also record the general ecosystem sound, so that the
Mm.
whole stream singing, and then also use it to record how people are adding to that soundscape, which may or may not be beneficial. But often, now learning, colleagues that work in marine environments, on whales and whale song, and some of their stories about the way boat noises or harbor noises are disrupting these global
Oh,
patterns in
sure.
whale
It's
song are just
a,
so
a, gi-
sad.
a gigantic issue with big cruise ships. Really,
Yeah,
really, really terrible. And
I imagine I'd find the noise quite hard on all of those too.
the so-called America's Cup of Sailing, I did field work on in Barcelona 2 years ago, and just extraordinary because Barcelona has, more cruise ships
Yeah.
in the world than anywhere else anyway, um, by far, all the time. But of course, they and the, so-called super yachts were there, but in multitudes in the period of the America's Cup. And people are still working out the impact that had on sea living animals. But I know when the America's Cup was held in New Zealand, Aotearoa, a few years earlier, there have been studies come out already that are just scarifying. I mean, absolutely horrifying on what this
Yeah.
was doing for the audio lives of sea turtles.
Yeah. And I think that's back to something you were talking about before, like caring about the animals and thinking about the bison and in the camping ground is trying to have that empathy and broadening our, not only our ethical but our consideration of animals and how they're experiencing the world and what we've done to their experiences as well as
Speaking
fragmenting
of
and losing their habitats.
that, I've got to try to stop one of the podcasts from destroying the cable that is allowing us to speak.
Must be annoying and
Gnawing it, but also using his claws. And I, every now and then, because the word no doesn't mean much to cats, I do that terrible thing of picking up a little bottle of water and spraying it because, as you know,
because that means no.
pussycats
Oh,
are
see,
not,
I'm a dog person, so dogs definitely no,
pussycats are not as keen on water as you are, Prof, shall we
no.
say?
I've got a cat dog, so he's not very keen on water
You have a
either.
cat dog. Okay.
Cat dog. He's like a tiny little terrier. He curls up behind my knees like a cat and
Oh, cute.
ticks both boxes.
Well,
Yes.
my problem is that this guy only speaks Euskera. He's from the Basque country, and it's the last remaining Paleo-European language. But if you've ever encountered Euskera or Basque, it is unlike any other language in the world. There's just nothing connecting it to the Indo-European languages, the Asiatic ones, anything. And I can't speak Euskera, and he
Doesn't sound like
can't.
many people can.
Not many can. But if I could, it would all just be that much easier. Anyway, Prof, moving on. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I wanted to ask you about a couple of other papers that you've written.
Sure.
You've written so many, and it's so rich, really, the field that you operate in. And some are very specific, and
Yes.
some are very broad. And I wanted to ask you about one of the very broad ones, which is called Future of Freshwater Ecosystems, given the 1.5 degree centigrade warming,
Which we're now committed to.
which, of course, ho, 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 we're committed to.
Yeah.
Yes, I shouldn't laugh. But imagining for a moment that that were the level of warming or heating that occurred, what do you see as the future of freshwater systems?
I see much sharper divides. So I think about landscapes where some wet parts are wetter, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So, drowning trees and wetter so that there's water quality problems and things that are intensified. And then much just sharper, discrete boundaries with the areas. So the haves and the have-nots, so mirroring society in many ways, in our landscape. So areas that are very wet, possibly too wet, depending on what your benchmark is, and then areas that are very dry. And so I think at a very big, broad landscape scale, we're going to have these very fragmented, brittle landscapes. I think, we lose the softness that water provides by flowing over our landscape and connecting different systems. But I think that's because in a lot of places, the way that people are making these landscapes, our landscapes are more brittle. We're really good at putting lines and hard edges into our environment. So for me, the um, philosophy or the kind of general approach that we should take to guide adaptation and building adaptive capacity and resilience in the face of all this scary climate change is softening, blurring boundaries, and in riparian areas, bringing vegetation to water. So anytime there's just concrete or walls, we need to work our ways to blend and have gradients to combat that, I think, tendency of um, increasing lines and disparities in the environment that this is going to bring. Yeah. And that's going to be in time as well as space, right? Times of plenty and times of much longer times of not enough.
I've got one last question for you. And when you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish. And that
Sure.
addition might take the form of something entirely new, a theme we've not discussed, or it might be retracing some of the steps that we've covered in our conversation up to this point. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to
Fabulous.
close?
Yes.
So the last question is really to inquire as to what's on the docket for you. What's next? What's the upcoming project? Or don't you know yet? I don't know.
Oh, I know.
Whoa, you heard
So,
it here first,
uh,
folks.
I'm actually about halfway through a second PhD in philosophy. Um,
Oh,
and
okay.
in that, so I'm a much slower, more considered PhD regarding the role of aesthetics in ecological science. Um, so how the way we feel about the environment affects the way we do ecological science, affects
Mm-hmm.
environmental decision making, and then vice versa, how, all of our, as ecologists, our cultural and historical backgrounds, economic backgrounds, then flavors the way we conduct ecological science and what that means for I guess the way environmental resources and landscapes are managed by people and who gets to say. And so for me, this is really coming to a fore in all these emerging environmental markets and nature finance. And I know in the Americas there have been some very long-standing, particularly those wetland markets in the southeast, but we have a new nature repair market in Australia. So the Green Wall Street, where restoration projects or conservation projects are going to be bought and sold supposedly once it gets off the ground by big corporate interests. And so I think this has a big potential to change the way all of us feel about nature because um, we're commodifying it and labeling it and packaging it. So I think that's really relevant to everything else we've been talking about. So I'm interested in the philosophical aspects and the philosophy of science in informing that way that we commodify and package and label nature. And for me, there's a big part of nature that is denied in that process. So all of a sudden, as soon as you start doing it, what I think of as nature is diminished, it's gone. So, also related to this is monitoring. So, we've got the technology now, it's getting cheaper and easier to access and use to monitor the environment everywhere. And, so there'll be a lot of people wanting to put little buttons and things in everywhere so that the whole world is monitored and we have all this data. So a bit like social media for people, that who want to know where every drop of water is, every bird, every insect, and in the name of being able to manage that all better. Um, yeah, I remember, for instance, when I was in the third trimester with my second daughter and had one of these fancy new 3D ultrasounds and took it home, and my father was horrified. He said, "What about the privacy of the child? That you get this image of them in the womb, like they weren't asked." And I think that now, so these wild desert landscapes, and I know there's a long association with people, thousands of years of people looking after and caring for these environments, but in a very different way, I think, to the way Western approaches now want to go in and meter them up. So I'd like to see places that are left away from the constant eye of Big Brother, I suppose. And if that means we risk not putting water in the right place at the right time to support a particular threatened species and some extinctions, to me, I think it's still important that we allow nature to have some privacy and agency away from people. So
Mm-hmm.
those are the kind of issues I'm interested in, and if
Wonderful.
I would like to
Well,
make any change in the world, that's where.
there is such a rich philosophical tradition, cosmovisions of indigenous peoples. For example, in Latin America, it's a really big element of degrowth as a logic, not, I suspect, one of the logics that got much truck yesterday at the event you were at, through to the way in which all the forms of Western philosophy have both rhapsodized about nature and sought to discount and control it. Amazing. You know, when Hegel was writing about the idea that you had to put semiotic marks on nature in order to own it, and if you didn't own it, it was of no value. He was also making his living by writing journalism about wild boar hunts.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that kind of hypocrisy throughout these areas presently.
Um, so that's wonderful and good on you for venturing into philosophy. Given your background, I think it can only enrich philosophy as well as, I imagine, giving some new ways of thinking to your own practice, as it were. That's really exciting. And given all of that, is there anything you'd like to add to what we've discussed? As I said, might be something entirely new, might be adding to what we've already touched on.
Oh, well, I think learning and studying and contributing, I think, so entirely new and separate from what we have talked about, then I think I'm a big fan and promote later in life PhDs. I think that there are so many people who've done amazing things, and if you think about it as something people should do when they're young, and universities maybe promote that. I'd certainly have to fight a little bit to get accepted into do a second one, but that people, on the brink or even in retirement, and to bring their knowledge and their bearing and share that perspective of lifetimes in work, I think is like underestimated and undervalued in our society. And there should be more of that, of people continuing to learn and to share and to undertake PhDs. I still think they're a very valuable
What a
thing to.
wonderful thing to say. And maybe I'll need to quote you or enlist you. A friend of mine who's in his early 60s, who didn't get a very good first degree in terms of rankings and ratings, but was an enormously successful businessman in all sorts of fields, has finally been seduced by people like me and is wanting to do his doctorate on Marxist political economy.
That's excellent. I'd like to read that.
I know, because here's someone who's worked very successfully at the top level in all these fields of capitalist endeavor, who's, in retirement, seen the light, as it were, or
Yeah,
perhaps he has. Maybe he will feel differently when he finishes his research. But I agree. And I think that that's one of the things that's really lost now in the commodification and the governmentalization of higher education. The fact that
yeah,
older people can learn so much. When I was an undergrad, one of the great things was that there was a fashion for women returning to education to do undergraduate studies when their children had grown up. People, often working class women who'd had very little opportunity to study. Now, whether they went on and did doctorates, I don't know, but they enriched massively the kinds of conversations we had in class.
absolutely.
Is
Yes,
there
I've
room for
worked with
them
a woman
today?
like that. Yeah, and I try to support that in our lab as well. And yeah, I've worked for a woman who had three children and then went back and did her undergraduate, made it to professor and the Australian Academy of Sciences. So yeah, I think there's no end to what you can do when you've got some passion and something to say.
But there also need to be infrastructural systems of support. Some people may just be able to do it because of what they're like as an individual, but it needs to
That's
be
right.
more
But
than that, I think.
well, that's a whole other conversation to talk about what universities need to do to move into a new world. Yes.
Indeed.
Um,
Well, thank you again so much for being with us. I've learned a great deal from what you've written, and I've really learned even more from talking to you today.
well, thank you, Toby. It's been a pleasure, and to your pussycats there as well. I know that are roaming around over the wires.
Indeed. Happy days.